Welcome to the Bucket Courses. My name is Barb Lease, and I'm very glad to see all of you here. Here are some things you need to know before we start. Please silence your cell phones. Turn on your T-coil if you have one. If there's time for questions, Judy and I will come around with the microphones. Please speak directly into the mic. If you're able, please help put your chairs up at the end. On the dollies, there's 2 at the front, and there's 2 dollies at the back. And now for the main event. Like Edith Renfrow, Monique Shore is a Grinnell College alum. For over 30 years, she's been the technology administrator at Grinnell's Public Library. She oversees all computer, audiovisual, website, and online resources. Fortunately for us, one of the favorite parts of her job is preserving and sharing local history through digital archive projects. This includes the Poweshiek History Preservation Project, which is how she met Edith Renfrow Smith in 2015. Thanks to this friendship, Monique and a small dedicated group of people in Grinnell are sharing Edith Renfrow Smith's story with the community she still calls home. Please join me in welcoming Monique Shore.
Thank you all. I need to check and make sure my mic is good. So are we good on the microphone? Excellent. So it's a little intimidating to be on this side of the room. I'm always up here making sure the computer works, but it's wonderful to have so many of you here. I will say that we just a few minutes ago figured out that the library's publicity for this actually set a 10:30 start time. So if people start wandering in a little late, let's make sure that we can find a seat for them. So that was an unfortunate slip that we missed. Anyways, yeah, so it is wonderful to be with you here and to share what we've learned about Edith Renfrow Smith. I did meet her when she was 101 through the PHPP project, the Poweshiek History Preservation Project. She came and we scanned a bunch of her family photos. So all the photos that you see of her family in this all came from her on that trip when she was 101. And then she met in this very room with Dan Kaiser, who's here somewhere, and did a live oral history interview. We have the video of that on our website, and it is a true gem. So if you want to learn more, I encourage you to check that out on our website. So I always like to start with these pictures of Edith from the last few months. So Edith is currently 108 years old. Here she is looking spiffy on Christmas Day. I don't know if you all dress up like that on Christmas Day. I don't, but she was looking good. And in early December, when the college announced that Renfrow Hall would be named in her honor, the college did a big event here, and then she was with a group of people in Chicago celebrating that, zooming in, as we do in 2022 and 2023. And then just a couple weeks ago, I visited her in Chicago. I am writing a children's biography of her life, and so I wanted to read that to her and get her blessing before we went any further on the project. So that was March 25th. She is amazing. She is still sharp and has a quick wit and is just a joy and delight. So, but let's get to a little bit about her early ties. So she was an adorable 2-year-old. I think we can all agree, and an adorable toddler. So this week I am going to focus really on her deep roots in the community. So her family ties go back to 1859. So I'm going to talk about that part, and then next week Tamara is going to really talk about Edith herself. But today we are going to learn some of the stories that we've discovered as we've dug more into her life. So to start with, I'm going to do a really quick overview of Grinnell and the Renfrows family in the 1860 to 1900, because I want you to kind of have a big picture, and then I'm going to come back and I'll go into the details of some of the more details of some of the stories. So Grinnell was founded in 1854 by Josiah B. Grinnell. It was founded on a location that would be the future site of where two rail lines would intersect. So there was nothing here but open prairie at the time that the town was founded. In 1859, so 5 years later, John Brown, famous abolitionist, one of his last journeys before the Harper Ferry, before he lost his life at Harper's Ferry, was a trip through Iowa. So he started in Missouri, and he traveled through Iowa. One of the stops he made was in Grinnell. He stopped at the home of J.B. Grinnell, and the men were put up in Josiah Grinnell's barn. The women were put up in the room of one of the hotels. And then they traveled on. They left the state, and they found freedom in Canada. Now, George Craig is Edith's grandfather. George Craig says that he traveled with John Brown through Grinnell in 1859. We'll go into more detail about what we know about that story. Later in 1859, in November 1859, a black man named Henry Lucas arrived in Montezuma and purchased farmland. He was the first black man to purchase farmland in Poweshiek County, one of the early ones in the state. So his farmland is still owned by his great-great-grandson. These two families will intersect. That's why I'm giving you the overview. Okay, all of that was before the Civil War. It was before the Emancipation Proclamation. It was before the first train actually arrived in Grinnell. So the story of this family goes back to before the first train arrived. Okay, in 1864, okay, so we started in 1859. 5 years later, George Craig, who had traveled through the state escaping slavery, married a woman named Eliza Jane Gilball. They were married in Cedar County, so think Iowa City area. So we'll go more into how we think maybe that happened. By 1875, now we're jumping back to the farmland owner, this black man who had arrived in 1859, by 1875 he owned 320 acres near Ewart. Well, how did that happen? All right, so we're going to talk a little bit about that. So if you know Grinnell history, you know in 1882 there was a cyclone that took out all of the campus and a bunch of the town. So this is just kind of giving you points in history so you can put all these things in there. A couple years later, John Brown Lucas, the son of the farm owner, and Dora Craig, the daughter of George and Eliza Craig, were married in Oskaloosa. By 1890, the two oldest daughters of this couple had moved to Grinnell. No. Dora, I misspoke, sorry. So Dora was the one that got married. So she and her husband spent a couple years on the farm in Ewart, then they moved to Grinnell. Her sister also married a Grinnell man and was in Grinnell by 1890. Okay. In 1895, they had triplets. So that created some change in the family that will come into the story as well. So similarly, understandably, 1895, all of a sudden, George and Eliza, the grandparents, and their youngest daughter, Eva Pearl, moved to Grinnell from Oskaloosa. I wonder why that might have been, right? So might have had something to do with the triplets, we're guessing. Okay, so by their youngest daughter at that point, Eva Pearl, was now in Grinnell with them, and by 1901 she had met a man named Lee Augustus Renfrow and was married in the living room of the family home. Okay, there's your big overview. Now we're going to talk about a couple of these stories and the specifics of what we've learned about them. We're going to talk about George Craig, her grandfather, Eliza Jane, her grandmother, and then Henry Lucas, the man who bought the farmland down in Ewart. Okay, so this is a record from Ancestry. How many of you have ever looked at Ancestry and the records there? So Ancestry pulls information in from kind of public records, so as well as allows people to add what they know, even if they haven't found confirmation of it. So when you look at this record, you can see that some of this stuff is coming from census records, right? And so you can track where he was at. Now, one of the things that's interesting is his birth says that he was born in Kentucky, Kansas, and Missouri. So, so when there is not a birth record, you're putting in there your best guess, right? So, and often there's not a firm date even. So, so he was born, we believe, in Kentucky. Then he was a slave and then was moved to Missouri. We'll go into that story more. And then he was married around the marriage record is actually 1864, but he married Eliza Jane. They lived in Oskaloosa for the bulk of their time raising their girls. And then by 1900, they were in Grinnell. Okay, so let's talk a bit about his story. So in 1895, after they had moved to Grinnell, George Craig's story was printed in the local paper. So he had gone to Leavenworth, Kansas. He was returning there because there had been a very formative event in his life and his escape from slavery that happened there. So while he was in Leavenworth, he gave an interview to the Leavenworth Times, and then that was reprinted in the local paper, in the Grinnell paper. So I think that it's best, all of these articles that I'm going to be reading from today, these are all things that we've digitized and we've put on our website. So if you picked up one of the booklets, in the back there's a list of the references. All of these things you can go in and read the full article yourself. This one is in really poor shape, so I've actually typed it up so it's easier to read what it says. I'm just going to share with you a little bit from this story. Craig was stowed away in the cellar. Well, let's wait. I'm jumping ahead of myself. He was born a slave, okay? When he was in Missouri, and he was sold to a slave trader that wanted to sell him south. He knew that if he went south, it would be a lot harder to escape. So he wanted to find a way to avoid that fate. So as a teenager, he took and he rubbed tobacco juice in his eyes to make his value on the auction block less. So when they tried to sell him, the physician or whoever would check him out and the sale wouldn't go through. This happened 7 times. Soon after, he escaped and found refuge in Leavenworth, with some folks who were tied to the Underground Railroad where they protected him. So this bit is his recollection of that time. Craig was stowed away in the cellar. The dragoons searched in vain but persisted, and at irregular intervals the tunnel was inspected. Craig was kept in that cellar for 3 weeks and off and on for a whole year. The slave men maintained such a diligent search for Craig and so closely patrolled the road to Lawrence that it was the spring of 1859 before he could be smuggled out. He was taken over there in April with some 20-odd others and started east in charge of John Brown. Craig was dropped off near where Grinnell, Iowa now stands. John Brown went on east to Boston, then to Canada, and a few months later made the famous assault at Harper's Ferry. So this journey by John Brown is pretty well documented. They've done a lot of research on it. The State Historic Preservation Office has put together an entire website with all sorts of research and documentation that they've found. You can go in and you can look county by county at the people that they have identified that are known to have helped, right? So whether they were conductors or whether they were freedom seekers. So George Craig is listed there as someone who was known from Poweshiek County to have been on that journey or believed to have been on that journey. So they also go through a stop at a time and tell you where each stop was, what the days were, and how that progressed. So what they know, and this is backed up by J.B. Grinnell's own memoirs, is that on February 20th, 1859, John Brown and his group of escaping slaves stopped in Grinnell, stayed at J.B. Grinnell's house, the women in the hotel, protected, and they were here for 2 days. They were largely embraced by the community, but, you know, there's always a few people that are upset, and so they had to move on. So a couple stops later, so they spent the next night in one town, the next night another time, so stop 14. So 3 days later, they were in Springdale. Now, Springdale was a large Quaker community. They stayed in Springdale for 2 weeks. Now, why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this because the woman that he married had been protected by a Quaker woman and had moved to Iowa. So perhaps Eliza Jane was a part of this Quaker enclave where they spent 2 weeks. Because what else would explain why, after escaping to freedom in Canada, that George would come back to Iowa, right? So, I don't know, maybe it's the romance in me that thinks that maybe that was the case, but something brought him back to Iowa 5 years after that journey of escape. So, let's talk a little bit about Eliza Jane then. So, Eliza was the daughter, the third daughter, the youngest daughter, of an enslaved woman named Jane and a white French plantation owner named Antoine Gilball. So there's just hardly a better way to do this than to read the account that was printed in 1937 when Eliza graduated from college, or when Edith graduated from college. So this article was written by a man who was her professor, and he had talked with Edith, and he had talked with Edith's mother, and Edith's mother shared this account of the story of Eliza Jane. "My grandmother was a slave," she began, "owned by a French planter in South Carolina. This man, Gilball, never married. Instead, he grew to love one of his slave girls, my grandmother, and in time made her mistress of his house, treating her with honor and affection. When children came, he accepted them as his own and gave them every advantage, even planning for their complete education by a clause in his will. Because there were no schools at that time for Negroes in the South, the 2 older children were sent away into Ohio to what is now Wilberforce University. During his last sickness, the planter had given his slave mistress her freedom and told her to take little Eliza Jane, her youngest, and Mrs. Renfrow's mother to join Edith's mother. Sorry, that's confusing. To take Eliza Jane, her youngest, to join the other children in Ohio. The slave woman refused to leave the sick man, giving her little girl instead into the hands of a man who was emigrating into Ohio, with instructions to turn her over to a Quaker lady there who was to be paid to care for her until she was old enough to go to Wilberforce. My grandmother stood and watched the covered wagon drive away," continued Mrs. Renfrow, "taking her baby girl. She never saw her children again. For on the death of her master, his brothers, who had no patience with his ideas, burned my grandmother's writ of freedom before her eyes and forced her back into slavery, dividing their brother's estate among themselves. Years later, when the 3 children were grown, they sent an attorney back to South Carolina to try to collect a part of their father's estate. He not only failed to collect, but was warned to clear out in a hurry. He gathered the story from the neighbors, just as I have told it to you." So she was sent away to be cared for by some Quakers in Ohio. After her father died and the funds stopped, things didn't go so well. So I will continue. Stories, the woman who was caring for her was not very nice. Stories of her cruelty finally reached the ears of a kindly woman, also a Quaker, who got possession of the child, brought her up in her own home, and in due time sent her to be educated at Wilberforce. Some years later, tempted by stories of the fertility of the land beyond the Mississippi, she migrated in the customary covered wagon of the day to Iowa, taking Eliza Jane with her. There, in due time, Eliza Jane was married to a young man not to the taste of her benefactress, who, irritated by her young ward's choice of a mate, cut her off without a cent of long-promised dowry. It's amazing to have these accounts of these lives. And so there's just no better way to share the story than their own words. In digging around and using the various resources that we have here through the library for such things, I was actually able to find a copy of the will of Antoine Gilball. And so here, and I will read it because it's a little hard to read, is what was written in his will. I give and bequeath unto my executors my Negro woman Jane, her son Aaron and daughter Eliza, with a positive injunction and dying request that they have them removed to the state of Ohio, where Catherine, a girl I have already manumitted, resides. I give to my executors all the rest of my estate, which I earnestly request, and enjoin upon them to apply so much thereof as may be sufficient for the removal of the Negroes named above, and that when removed they give Jane $100 for their support and maintenance for 1 year, and that they put the balance out in interest and send annually the interest to Ohio to be equally divided among them. And that will was burned after he died. So her father, by every indication, really wanted the best for his children with Jane. So Eliza had been put in the care of this Quaker woman who came to Iowa. So we don't know. We've got some students lined up to do additional research this summer, so we're hoping to firm up some of this stuff. But what I'm wondering is if that Quaker woman wasn't a part of this group of Quakers in Springdale, and if there wasn't an interaction there that led to the marriage of George and Eliza. So they were married there in Cedar County. By 1870, they had moved to Oskaloosa. Their oldest daughter, Dora, had been born actually in Tipton, but soon after they moved to Oskaloosa. And one thing that I'll point out is these records that are in in Ancestry. If you've never done any genealogy research like this, this is the kind of thing that you'll find. So when they take these records, they're writing out what that says. It's just the person who wrote that down didn't know how to spell their last name. They may not have known how to spell their last name, right? So that it's before literacy, there's all sorts of things. So there's a lot of things that where there's variations in name spellings and stuff. So, but we know that they were in Oskaloosa by 1870, and that by 1880 they had been joined by two other daughters, Anna and Eva Pearl, and so and then by 1900 they were in Grinnell. This record for George Craig does state that he was born in Kentucky. So this one's a little firmer than that first one that we looked at, right? So that's good to see. You can also see that George and Eliza were living. This is a census record. So George and Eliza, the parents, were living in Grinnell, and that their youngest daughter, who was 24 at the time, Eva Pearl, was actually living with them there. So by 1902, this is their family in Grinnell. So this is George and Eliza. This is their three daughters. And this is all of their grandchildren at the time. Kind of. But we'll go into that more in a little bit. Eliza actually lived out her life in Grinnell. This is a photo that Edith provided to us of Grandma Craig. She tells us that she loved to sit on her porch. She would often be there when they came home from school. They'd walk by and talk to Grandma on their way home from school. Probably got a cookie, I'm guessing. So she lived in Grinnell until her death in 1924. She's buried out at Hazelwood Cemetery. Now, George, her husband, his final days were a little sadder. Something happened. We're not quite sure. We've got the Grinnell Herald Register is now online and searchable up through 1925. And so there are little snippets throughout the paper that hint to some hard times. So he was arrested, it looks like, for bootlegging. This reference talks about how he is seriously ill. This one talks about him needing to go somewhere for treatment. What we know is that he died in the state hospital at Mount Pleasant, which is the hospital for people who were struggling mentally. The family doesn't know where he's buried. So they thought that he was buried in Montezuma. There's no record of it. There was a fire at the courthouse that may have destroyed those records, but we haven't been able to track down where he's buried. But he's not at Hazelwood with the rest of the family. So that was a bit sad to find out. Okay, before break, we're going to shift our focus and talk about the story of Henry Lucas, the man who owned the farm, and how he came to be in Poweshiek County and how he came to have such a lovely farm. So Henry we know, was born on a plantation in Virginia. So Henry's story was written by his son. No, I'm sorry. Am I getting my, yeah. So Henry's story was written up by his son, John Brown Lucas, the one who married the Craig's daughter, in an article in 1932. This is a 5-page article. It is very in-depth. So if you want to read it, the whole thing is available on our website. It talks about his childhood as a slave, some of the horrendous things that he endured. And then it talks about how he came to have enough money to purchase his own freedom and then start this farmland. So this is a great article. And so I have pulled a few snippets out because I think that's the best way to share, kind of in their own words. So the key points are that he was born on a plantation to a man named Preston. Colonel Preston, the senior Preston, had been an officer in the Revolutionary War and was not a very kind slave owner. But when he had a son named John Preston, and when John was old enough and was being sent off to start his life, Colonel Preston let him choose 20 of the slaves from their plantation to take with him. So Henry was one of those chosen to go with the younger Preston, as was the woman that he would eventually marry. Okay? So John is the name of John Preston, okay? John is the name of the new, younger slave owner. John left Virginia and went south, taking Henry with him as a body servant. In Helena, Arkansas, young Preston had a law office, and he and Henry boarded at the hotel. There was not enough work at the office nor his rooms to keep Henry busy, so he made arrangements with the hotel to work as helper in the kitchen, thus paying his own and his master's board. Henry learned to be a chef, was very thrifty, and often received tips from customers at the hotel. He did various jobs for different people, for which his master allowed him to keep the money he earned. So Henry fell in love with another one of the slaves, Lottie. They were married and they had 3 children. A few years later, when the Mexican-American War started, John went to the front and took Henry with him. So while John was off fighting, he allowed Henry to stay behind and to do other odd jobs for other officers, for the hotel, and again, to keep the money that he made. So by the end of the war, Henry had enough money that he asked to purchase his freedom. So he paid $700 and purchased his freedom. However, he still had a wife and 3 children who were on the plantation. He continues, when the papers were signed and money paid, Henry left the plantation, went to Helena, bought a horse and dray, and went into the draying business. Do any of you know what the draying business is? I had to look it up. So, yeah, hauling, yeah. So this venture took all of his savings. He now had another great desire. His wife and children were Preston's slaves, and he wanted them free also. So he worked with new energy and great determination to bring that about. So he's working away, and all of a sudden, gold is discovered in California. And a group of men from the area that he was in decided that they were going, and they wanted him to go with them. He said, I just spent all my money on this stuff. I don't have any money to go with you. They said, if you'll come with us, if you'll drive one of the wagons, drive our mule team, and be the cook, that'll pay your way. So he got on board and he headed to California. Now, as you read the story, some of the men who were with him were not quite up to the task. So some of them didn't do quite so well, but he did pretty well. When he got to California, he partnered up with a man named Robert Morrison. The two of them had the word is escaping me, had a gold a mine, right? A claim, yes, and they were quite successful. So after a while, they decided they had made enough and they were going to return. So they hopped on a ship. They went down to Panama. They crossed the Panama. There was no canal then, the isthmus, right? And as they were going on the boat through the Gulf of Mexico to get up to New Orleans, Henry became very ill. So Robert Morrison cared for him. He protected his sizable earnings that they were carrying back with them. When they got to New Orleans, Mr. Morrison got him into a hospital, got him care, and once he was healthy, gave him all of his part of the earnings, and the two went their separate ways. Morrison followed his love and moved to Iowa, to Montezuma, Iowa, and started his life. Henry went back to Mr. Preston and purchased the freedom of his wife and his 3 children, $1,000 for his wife, $300 for each of the children. I'll read from what happened next. The English language has not words enough to express the happiness of that family. Free, free. But great happiness does not last long, and this family was no exception. It was only 2 short weeks when cholera visited the home, and sorrow filled their hearts. Little Phoebe, age 8, was stricken and died 2 weeks from the date her father had bought her. And then, so heartache there, joy and heartache. Henry and his wife opened a restaurant. They were quite successful, it seems. And then in the spring of 1859, Arkansas passed Act 151. And Act 151 said that any free Negroes in the state must leave or be sold back into slavery. Now, all this time, Henry had kept in touch with Robert Morrison, who was now in Iowa. So he wrote to Mr. Morrison explaining the situation, and Morrison wrote back and said, come to Iowa. Come to Iowa, and I will help you get set up. So Henry and his wife sewed $1,000 each into their travel clothes, packed up the belongings that they could take with them, and they arrived in Poweshiek County in November 1859 and were picked up by Mr. Morrison, where they stayed with him for the winter. But by November 9th of 1859, just weeks after their arrival, we believe, they had purchased their first land in Poweshiek County. So they were that first land was just north of Montezuma. According to the article, they didn't have the best welcome in that area, so they soon moved to Ewart. where they began purchasing land, and by 1875 had 320 acres and a quite successful farm. 160 of those acres are still owned by his great-great-grandson. Doesn't farm it, he lives in Omaha, but it still is owned by the family. So, right? So that's the grandparents' generation. I think my timing has actually worked out pretty well, and that we're going to take a break. And then when we come back, I'll tell you a bit about the next generation.
Thank you. Once again, Monique Shore.
All right, are you rested and refreshed? Ready for the next generation? Okay, so we are going to focus for this second half on the daughters of George and Eliza Craig. So this photo, 1902, shows who we've got. So George and Eliza are here, and their daughters. So Dora is the oldest, Anna is the middle child, and Eva Pearl was the youngest. These are mostly, later on I've got a label that says who's who. So we're just going to start with the daughters and tell their stories. So the Craig sisters, this is a lovely picture of the three of them. And so we're just going to start with the oldest and talk a little bit about what we know. So Dora married John Brown Lucas and was the mother of 8, including those triplets. So how did John Brown and Dora meet? It's always the question you have, right? So there weren't very many blacks in the area. Certainly there was no openness for interracial marriage at that time. Well, again, we are grateful that this family often had their stories published. So in 1938, when they celebrated their 54th wedding anniversary here in Grinnell, they interviewed John Brown about their life together. Now, I will say, as a woman, as I'm reading this article, I'm like, they only are telling his perspective. So with that caveat, but he does share that he was on a farm, living on a farm in Ewart. So if you know the geography of the area, Ewart is south of here, and then a little further south of that is Oskaloosa. So this bit of this article talks about how the Lucas boys, one of them was going off to barber school in Oskaloosa, and when he was down there, he heard about some other black families. So John went with him one day and met Dora because the Craigs were living in Oskaloosa. So they were married on December 31st of 1883, so a New Year's Eve wedding, and they spent a couple of years on the farm before they decided to move to Grinnell. So their first child, Henry, there's so many Henrys, and there's so many, the name, like it's, I've always got to look up, make sure I'm using the right name, because they often repeated the names. So their oldest son, Henry, was born at the farm in Ewart, and then they had a second son, Bruce, who was born after they moved to Grinnell. And then in 1895, they had triplets. So just take a minute to imagine that, right? So they've got 2 young kids, and then they have triplets. And again, this comes from another newspaper article. So Eva Pearl Renfrow, so this is Edith's mother, was actually interviewed by the Montezuma paper in 1951. They had run there had been another set of triplets born in the state, and that the paper picked up that, oh, this isn't the first triplets born in this area, the Lucas triplets. So they were doing a little retrospective on the triplets. And so Eva Pearl was interviewed about her time, what she knew about the triplets. So this is a snippet from that article where Eva Pearl, Mrs. Renfrow, says, Mrs. Renfrow, who now lives alone in her spick and span home in southwest Grinnell, recalls the births of the babies vividly. She remembers helping the distraught mother care for one of the girls, and another lady watched after another while the mother took the remaining baby. So, yeah, caring for the triplets is something that Edith's mother had told her about, that was one of the things when she was a young woman when they moved to Grinnell that she had helped with. So Martha, Rebecca, and Mary. It also says right there at the top, I don't know if you noticed it, that the triplets weighed 21 pounds at birth. So they were healthy-sized kids, and poor mama. So right. So how did they fare? And to this, I will give my shout out to Mr. Dan Kaiser, who, if you do not know, Dan kind of started all this. I'm just going to cast blame where blame is due. So years ago, Dan decided that he wanted to, in his retirement, obsess about Grinnell history, right? So he has spent many, many, many hours researching stories of Grinnell history, focusing on the stories that have been untold. So he began researching the Renfrow family and other blacks in the community. He's the one that first came to me and said, "Hey, Monique, this is an amazing family. We don't have any pictures of them. Do you think you could use your digital archive project to maybe get in touch with Edith and see if she could share any family photos?" So it's all his fault. So we got in touch with Edith, right? We got in touch with Edith, and it's been magical ever since. But through that first idea of reaching out to her, we began to gather these stories. So anyways, Dan put his stories about the Renfrows and other blacks of Grinnell's early days into a book that the library has a copy of. If you want to check it out, it's still available. I have it at the front desk. First one there gets to take it home today. Grinnell Stories, African Americans of Early Grinnell. So it's got a chapter on each member of the Renfrow family as well as other families. And in the back, there is a very impressive list of short biographies of every African American that Dan came across. So this particular listing is the 3 triplets, and what he was able to find happened to each of them. So we know that Martha is the one that lived to adulthood, was married, and had children of her own. Mary, very sadly, little Mary Lucas, at 7 years old, came down with meningitis and passed away. And then we know that Rebecca was institutionalized, and sadly, in our conversations with Edith, we recently learned that they were told that Rebecca had died when she was about 8. They now know that she didn't, that she lived into her 30s, and that her family did not know. And so that's a really sad and disturbing thing that we've found out. And so who knows if we'll be able to find out any more about that. But anyways, that's what happened. That's what happened to the triplets. So this is the photo that's got them all labeled. Okay. So Violet, so the oldest is Henry here. Henry looking sharp at age 17. Violet at age 15. Bruce over here. Okay, so then the triplets were born. I was thinking the triplets were, anyways, I guess they had 3 toddlers three little ones when they had those triplets. So that's, woo! So one really curious thing about this picture is that only Martha, only the one triplet is listed. So it was labeled, the photo was labeled 1902. And so what year did I say that Mary died? So I'm wondering if it actually is 1903 after Mary passed away. But we can't quite figure out who this littlest one is. She's too young to be the other triplet, but so there's Dan hasn't figured it out, have you, Dan? See, so if Dan can't figure it out, so anyway, so that's what we know about this picture. And as I said, all of this information was recounted in this delightful article that was written in 1938 when they were celebrating their anniversary. So in this article, John, again, recounts, not in as much detail as in the earlier article, but talks about his father's story from escape and how he came to Poweshiek County. He does say in that article that he is thought to be the first black born in the state. I don't know how to confirm that, but that was the claim he made. He shares about how he met and married Dora. And then he talks about the various jobs that he had over the years. So he was a barber. He also was a shipping clerk for a furniture company here in Grinnell that then sent him to various places. For a while, they moved to Buxton. Now, Buxton, Iowa was a coal mining town that was predominantly black. It was quite unique, so he had a grocery store there. Buxton was kind of a boom and bust town. So once the mine gave out, the town dispersed, and at that point, they came back to Grinnell. He worked for a while as a fireman at the Spalding Manufacturing, and then he was also very active in the Methodist Church. So several references to him leading services, leading some funerals, and helping to co-teach a very popular Sunday school class. So interestingly, the entire article just says that Dora has always been a good helper to her husband. So no mention of the triplets, no mention of all the kids, just she was a good helper. So all right. So let's talk a little bit about Anna, the middle child. So Anna is the one that we had the least amount of information on. So it's been really interesting to dig into her story a little bit. So what we knew pretty early on was that she operated a beauty shop in Grinnell, and that she had one son, because one of the pictures that Edith had given to us was a picture of Anna and her son. So again, we go into Ancestry, and we can look and see that she married a man named Edward Good in 1887. Now, Edward was a barber in Grinnell, so that's presumably why they ended up in Grinnell. They were married in Oskaloosa, and then soon moved to Grinnell. So we know that Anna was a beautician. The old papers are full of ads for her services. And so manicuring chiropody. Anybody heard of chiropody? I had to look it up. It's feet, yeah. So, and the only reference I could find was this new American chiropody furniture, which is a special chair apparently for this purpose. So all of her ads talk about chiropody. So she must have given great foot massages. I'm there for it. So that's good. So, later, the business was listed at different places over the years in the different ads. 715 Spring was their home. If you are a Fairway shopper and ever take the back exit, that is it was recently torn down, and there's a lovely little duplex at that address. So 715 was where she lived and worked out of for a while, as did her husband for a little bit, I think. 829 is where Solera is, and 823.5 is above Family Dentistry. So kind of upstairs of those properties is where she had her shop. She had a shop for over 25 years, according to her obituary. And this was in the time before there were salons. So it was really kind of a new thing. Okay, so she married Edward Good. Edward Good was born in Ohio in 1860. He was left an orphan very, very young. Came to Grinnell when he was around 20 and was a barber. Soon met and married Anna. So one of the things Anna's story has a lot of things that don't quite make sense. So this is the first one. So this is the obituary. Very sadly, Edward died in 1901. his obituary talks about his work here and his marriage, and it says that he had one child, William, who is now 2 years old. This is May, right? His death date was May 1901. Okay. This is years later. This is Anna and William, their son. So the thing that is a little interesting is that William, when he passed away, his obituary and his tombstone say that his birth date was September of 1901. May 1901, September 9. He couldn't have been 2 years old, right? So that's a little confusing. But you assume that on the tombstone that the date that they have listed is the actual date of birth. So little bit of puzzling there. So I mentioned this to Edith one day, what she remembered about, this was before her time, but if there were any family stories that she'd heard. And that's when she mentioned Frankie. Now, looking at Dan's book, Dan knew about Frankie, but Frankie wasn't on my radar until Edith mentioned it this day. So who was Frankie? So, according to Edith, Anne adopted a little 7-year-old orphan who came from New York on the train. So this would have been, we'll just keep going. So the only record I've been able to find of Frankie is he is listed, his gravesite is listed in Find a Grave. And it shows here that he was aged 1 or 2 at the time of death, that he was born in 1893 and he was only a couple years old. Well, that doesn't make sense with he was a 7-year-old that she adopted, right? It also says down here that he's buried in the same plot as Edward Good. So what's up with that? So digging around a little bit more, in Ancestry, I was able to find his record that says that he was actually born in 1886 in Indiana, which also doesn't match with New York, whatever. So, but that he died in Grinnell in 1895. This matches up. The timeline kind of matches up with. We know that there were orphans that came on the orphan train through Grinnell. So that's what I'm kind of guessing is probably that he was an orphan on the orphan train, and came. Maybe arrived in Grinnell in 1893. Maybe that's why this date shows that, because it was only a couple years later after Anna had adopted him that he died. So let's talk about Anna and her heartache, right? So she married Edward in 1887. 6 years later, they still didn't have any children. So we can all imagine what that might have been like, right? They adopted Frankie, this orphan, in 1893, and then Frankie died, right? Then in 1901, after 12 years of marriage, she finally is pregnant. And then Edward dies. So she's left, whether he was a year or 2 old or whether he was still in the womb, right? We know she was a young, widowed mother raising this child on her own. So my heart just goes out to this woman, right? So this is, and all this time she's running a beautician shop, right? The only beautician shop in town. So then in 1914, this little bit pops up. In 1914, Anna married a man named Frank Fields in Davenport. Now, Anna was 40, and Frank was 31. Not bad. Not saying that that's a bad thing necessarily. It's just a curiosity. Remember, this is right around as World War I is ramping up, right? So, what could be happening there? I was able to find the registry, the marriage registry from that area, So up here, and I transposed it down here, but up here it shows the line where she's married. And I got to looking at it, and I looked up above, and I noticed that she's listed as the witness for the marriage that happened just above. So Frankie and Anna were married in Davenport, right? Record 23148. He's listed as a contractor from Grinnell. She's listed as it's her second marriage. That all matches. The record just above that, record 23147, has witnesses are Gigi Craig and Mrs. Anna Good. So apparently they knew these people, right, who were getting married. Or I don't know, if you were at the courthouse, would you just randomly grab the next people in line to be your witnesses? I mean that's possible, right? So, but it's also curious that this bride's last name is Good. So was it a relative? I looked to see if I could find that it was like a sister of her former husband. I couldn't find any confirmation of that, but maybe they were cousins or something, right? So this was very curious, right? The other thing that was really curious is I never found anything that used the last name of Fields. So what might have been going on there? So I started to dig a little bit more into Frankie Fields, and what I found is that Frank Fields ended up in prison just a few years later. So I don't know, maybe this was just one of those marriages nobody wanted to talk about, because she continued to use the name Good. She continued to work and run her shop here in town and advertise as Anna Good. And then in 1920, she married again a man named Solomon Brown, who was a cook at the college in the 20s and 30s, and that marriage lasted until her death. So she had, after all that early heartache, she had 25 years with Solomon Brown. And in this article after her death is where it talks about, for 25 years and before the days of beauty parlors, she was the only hairdresser in town. She also specialized in wigs and toupees. So interesting story of Anna, with lots of things that are still just, right? So, all right, let's talk about Eva Pearl. So, Eva Pearl, the youngest of the Craig sisters, married Lee Renfrow in the living room of the family home. And again, from Edith, we have this lovely portrait of her in her wedding gown. Their first child was born in 1904 here in Grinnell, Helen. And then they moved to Red Wing, Minnesota, presumably following Lee's work. So Lee was a chef, and so they often went to different places. So if you want more details on their story, Dan Kaiser's book has lots of information on this. So they moved to Red Wing for a while, but before long, they had their next three children were born in Minnesota: Alice, Rudolph, and Evanel. By 1910, they had returned to Grinnell. Now, they were Eva Pearl's mother, right? So Eliza Jane was next door neighbors to a man named Mumford Holland. Mumford was a man who had lived in Grinnell since the 1860s and was well known around town. He was their next door neighbor, and he had no children of his own. In his old age, he was getting of failing health, and so the family story goes that he reached out and said to Eva Pearl that if she would come back to Grinnell and care for him, that she would leave his house. He would leave his house to her. So that is our understanding as to what happened. So the children were adorable. Isn't it great to have these pictures? The pictures are it's just so wonderful. One of the things I asked Edith was, okay, People didn't have a camera in their pocket at that time. How did you get all these family photos, right? And she says, well, I don't know, but Mama was friends with everybody. So I think there was a neighbor that was a photographer. So in looking at the early maps, so they lived on 411 First Avenue, right across from Hazelwood Cemetery. And looking at the early maps, there was a member of the Child family in that same neighborhood. So the Child Art Studios was an early, Mr. Child was Arthur, I think. Child was an early photographer in town. So I'm wondering if they weren't just friends with the Child family and that they arranged to have fabulous photos taken. So we have this great record of their family. Okay, so the older children, and then Edith was born, and then Paul was just 2 years younger than Edith, and Edith says that they were just as close as twins and that they were real troublemakers. So according to her own account, they kind of drove their mom crazy. So this is the two of them with two of their cousins, the Mays cousins. So one of the children of Dora and John had married a man whose last name was Mays from Newton. This is a whole nother story that we've found and discovered of interest that having to do with Newton and the Underground Railroad activity. But so related to the Mays family of Newton. So they're hanging out with their cousins there on First Avenue. All right, so next week Tamara is going to talk more about Edith's life and about the influence that her mother had on her life. But I'm just going to give you a brief overview of some of the things that we know about Eva Pearl. So she was very active in the community. She very much believed in networking and making sure that her family was seen and known and that they could take any advantage that they could of networking with people. So they were active in the Congregational Church. She was in charge of the communion table. Edith remembers going to the church with her mama to set up for communion on the Saturday night before church. In 1929, Grinnell had a big festival celebrating the 75th anniversary, and they put on a play that the history of Grinnell. And so in that play, Eva Pearl had a role as the slave woman. And Edith just remembers how it was so exciting to see her mama up on that stage. So a very, very happy memory for them. And education. It was a huge priority for this family. Think about this family. Think about what you've learned about this family today. All 6 of these children went to college in the Depression era, in the 20s and 30s. So very, very high focus on education and making sure that they all worked together to make sure that they could each accomplish that. And she lived out her life in Grinnell. So she lived in town. Lots of people, and some of you here, maybe if you grew up in Grinnell, there are people that I still come across who tell me that, oh, I remember her. She'd always be out on her front porch after school, and she'd give us cookies. So there are still people around. So she was always active and inviting and welcoming, and is remembered by many people who were in town. Through the early 60s. So she died. She's buried out at Hazelwood Cemetery, as is Lee. There's a family plot there. Interestingly, 4 of their children are married in Grinnell at Hazelwood. So both of the boys, Rudy and Paul, are buried close to their parents. I'm sorry? And as is Alice. And Edith's family plot. Edith's husband died, and her oldest daughter has died, and they are both buried at Hazelwood, and there's a family plot there designated for Edith when the time comes, along with her other daughter. So there is just a strong tie to this community for Edith and her family. So all of the children were very successful. Evanelle became a professor of home economics and taught at historically black universities for most of her career. Alice went on to work at the Library of Congress for 40 years. Both Rudy and Paul served in World War II. Paul was an optician. Rudy was active in civil rights work in the D.C. area. So very interesting family. There's a little bit more in the booklet that many of you picked up, and there's lots more on each of them. So Dan has done a chapter on each of them except Edith, because he doesn't write about people who are still alive. And she's still alive. So, but if you want to know more, he's done amazing research on each of their lives. So I'm just gonna toss this little graphic up. This is the family tree that we've put together. When we started, we were just thinking about this little bit of family, and it has just expanded and expanded and expanded. And I've just shared with you the main stories today. So there are others that we've learned. Some of you may remember. Do any of you remember Booker and Alma Kiner? Yes, I know you do. So. Booker and Alma were, when you go back to this family tree, the kind of, Edith calls them shirt-tail relations. So Edith is over here, okay? So her parents were Lee and Eva Pearl, right? Or Eva Pearl was the daughter of George Craig. One of their other daughters, Dora, married John Brown, as we've talked about. John Brown's brother, Charles, married Clara. Charles died early after their first child was born. Clara's second marriage was to Kossuth Western, right? The Western family I know you talked about. And their daughter was Alma. So, and Alma and Booker farmed the land that Charles inherited from his father, right? And that land is still owned by the descendant of that first, of Charles and Clara. So, it's quite a tree. I feel pretty proud of myself to be able to put it together in a way that makes sense. So it was a challenge because we'd have these names thrown at us and we're like, wait, how are they related? I don't remember. So trying to visually figure out a way to represent that. So Booker and Alma, that's how they're connected. The Western family is another black family. They live in just south of Oskaloosa in Poweshiek County. They still farm their land. They also purchased their farmland in the early 1860s and have owned the land now for 150 years and farmed that. And then I mentioned earlier the family in Newton that is related through marriage. And their stories also go back to the Underground Railroad. Interestingly, just as a side note, Newton recently has had an addition. The Union Cemetery in Newton is now on the Underground Railroad Freedom Network, and they've done some nice research into that as well. So all of that is tied together, and stories that float around in my brain. So that's the end of the official presentation. I will do a little plug. I am writing a children's book about Edith and her story that I hope to have come out this fall. And so if you're interested in more information about that, let me know. But otherwise, that's the end of what I've got, unless you want questions. Wait for the microphone so that they can make sure to.
I can speak loudly. It's on. Go ahead. I have a question about that unidentified baby.
Yeah.
I assume that you must have asked Edith about that baby, and she doesn't remember it?
No. So that was 12 years before she was born. But I remember when she brought that photo in, Dan, you were there, and I remember being like, I don't know who that baby is. Wait, that's not one of them, so I don't know who that is. Yeah, so she doesn't have a recollection either. So she remembers a lot of things from the stories, but there is a limit. So, any other questions? Do any of you? I know a couple of you mentioned to me that you have some kind of a memory of Eva Pearl or getting cookies from her or whatever, and you knew Aunt Booker and Alma. Yep.
I lived for 35 years in the York neighborhood, so I
Yeah.
knew all of the Kiners really well.
Yeah.
But another thread for you to follow.
Okay.
I lived in Newton in the 50s, and as far as I know, there was only one black family living there named Jackson.
Okay.
Now, I'm guessing then that the Mays family are the ancestors of the Jackson family.
Possibly.
So you might want
yeah.
to follow that
yeah.
up.
Yeah, possibly.
Then.
Thank you.
And I think he was the only black person that the Maytag company hired.
Yeah. It's been really interesting because there were more black families in town in the early 1900s than there are, then there became very few. The children all moved away, right? So I think that's been true.
Another thing, I grew up 3.5 miles from Buxton.
Oh, okay. Yeah, yeah.
Do you think that Edith has any idea how fascinating her story is to all of us?
I can tell you that Edith is thrilled to have more people learning about her family stories. So she does know how fascinating it is, and I think she has waited 100 years for other people to discover it. So she is absolutely thrilled that more people are, and as we've been able to find this documentation to confirm, to give documentation to the family stories that she learned at her mother's knee and has always held and carried on. It's been exciting to be able to share those with her. Some of them she'd seen and some of them she didn't. So, but yeah, she definitely knows, and she's definitely excited to have more people knowing about it.
Just kind of a little side story. Helen, the sister, married a gentleman by the name of Lemmy,
Yep.
and moved to Iowa City, and I have kind of a personal connection. Evidently, I don't know specifics, but they were very active in the civil rights
They were.
movement in Iowa City, and there was a lot of racism where the students were concerned. They opened up their house to them.
Yeah.
I have a grandniece and a nephew who go to Lemmy Elementary
Yeah.
School in Iowa City that was named for Helen.
Yes.
Renfrow.
Yeah. So Helen and her husband were big civil rights leaders. She was very active in the community, in League of Women Voters and all sorts of things. But they opened their home up for black students when the university was not allowing blacks to live in the dorms. So they kind of had a boarding house for blacks for many years. She was tragically killed in a house fire. And a couple years after that, the community did choose to name an elementary school in her honor. So,
This is very interesting, thank you. I presume that you've been to the cemetery. I presume it's in the very, very oldest part of the cemetery, but if you were to go there, how do you proceed? Do you ask somebody in the...
that is a great question. The city actually has a fabulous website where you can enter the name of any grave that you want to find at Hazelwood, and it'll show you on a little map the location of that grave. Now, if you're not into doing stuff online, there are I could pull out a map and show you generally where they are. But yeah, yes. So the Renfrow plot and Edith's family plot are close together, and then her grandparents are close by. They're all kind of in the same section. There's actually Tamara has got some students that are going to be doing some research this summer, and one of the projects that they want to do is map all of the blacks that are out at Hazelwood and create some kind of a finding guide for that. We've also are in early discussions with the museum. They've started doing some cemetery tours, and so we're playing with the idea of having the next cemetery tour be focused on these. So watch for that next fall. So. Yeah.
I just want to add a little bit to the plug that Monique didn't complete. And that is that I discovered that she is launching a Kickstarter campaign to support the publication, self-publication of this wonderful book that's coming up. So I think everyone should know about that. And Monique was just too modest to mention that that's in the works as well.
Thank you, thank you. Yes, I've written the text of the book, and I found a wonderful illustrator, and I have to pay her so that she can do all the pictures of the book. So the Kickstarter campaign, and there's little cards out at the table if you're interested in supporting that. But that will get the funds to pay the illustrator to complete the book. Our dream is to get it to Edith so she can hold it in her own hands. So we're self-publishing because we want to move quickly. I've got connections from the alumni community who are helping me with getting it edited and refined. And so, yeah, more on that. But if you want to support it, there's little cards that have the website address for it. So, anything else? This has been great fun. Happy to share the story.
Thank you so much, Monique, for giving us valuable insight into the background of the remarkable Renfrow family in Grinnell and Poweshiek County and the challenges they faced. Their largely untold story is finally coming to light thanks to you, Dr. Babouf, Faven Getachow, and Dan Kaiser. We look forward to seeing everyone April 19th for the second part of the Renfrow Story, Edith Renfrow Smith and her deep roots in Poweshiek County, in which Professor Tamara Babouf will focus on the first 18 years of Edith Renfrow's life and the spaces that nurtured it, her home, schools, and Southwest Grinnell neighborhood. See you next week.